Clayton Thomas, and class of 1962 from the law school. My undergrad, I was at Villanova University, and I applied to 3 law schools, and all 3 were local Philadelphia schools. Fortunately, I got accepted to Penn, and it was probably one of the better decisions I made in my life. I was actually 21 years of age when I started law school, which was pretty young because we had an older class. We had a lot of classmates who were actually veterans of the Korean War, and we had some who were in their late 30s, just starting as 1Ls, which was very unusual. I felt that I was sort of like maybe premature in terms of even starting law school when I realized that some of these fellows were experienced out of school, working. Some even had other graduate degrees before they went to law school. But I was really impressed with the school. Obviously, it was a great law school in 1962, in the 60s, a premier law school, and totally different from today's environment here, which is what I wanted to talk about. I think there's a seismic change between what we see today at this institution and what we went through in the 60s, both from the standpoint of the faculty, the standpoint of the student body, the physical plant, and of course the culture was so different then. And it was an amazing, just coming out here today and celebrating a luncheon, it certainly makes you feel privileged and proud that you're a graduate of Penn Law School. But I would say that the law is the law, and I think even back then, I mean, even though the types of courses we got were the typical bread and butter courses, today they offer over 100 courses. We got a great education. The way the professors taught, and the Socratic method was phenomenal, and I'm still a big advocate of the Socratic method, which I know they still use at Penn. But when I think about the technology today and the advantages the students have today that we didn't have computers. Very few people even typed in those days. I mean, we had the old-fashioned typewriters, but when we took exams, everything was by hand, handwriting. Even the bar exam. I can remember sitting in a convention hall taking the bar exam, and I think there were only 4 people who had typewriters in those days who were typing their answers out. Everybody else hand wrote their answers out. But the faculty was absolutely the best here. Had some phenomenal teachers, and the memories of the classroom discussion and their teaching is just something you'll never forget. I mean, we had some icons like Leo Levin, who was everybody knew Leo Levin. He taught evidence, but he taught another course, but I had him for evidence, and he was a crackerjack, very dynamic, got everybody in the class involved, very entertaining, had a lot of stories. A couple of the other professors that stick out in my mind as being very distinguished, very erudite, and very, very accomplished were Louis Schwartz, who taught criminal law, was one. We had John Honold, who taught constitutional law, and we had one of my favorites was Noyes Leach, who taught a lot of courses, just a brilliant, brilliant guy. He was here for years. And I had him for agency, and then I had him for creditors' rights. And it was like going to class was like a thrill because you really wanted to go in and just hear the lecture, well, not the lecture, but hear the discussion get started with Professor Leach and calling on the classes and then his comments. And he spoke with a lisp. He had a little lisp. It was very distinctive. But one of the most brilliant professors I had here at the law school was Leach. We had Alexander Fry, who was great in corporate law, corporations. I could go on and on. Clarence Morris, civil procedure. We had a visiting professor our first year from the University of Texas, Charles Allen Wright, who at that time was still a very young professor. His field was civil procedure, and he had a growing reputation at that time as being an expert in the field of civil procedure. But at that time, they were just writing the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure in the 60s. They hadn't really codified them yet. And he was on that committee. So he geared our entire course on really the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure and how they're being drafted. And a lot of the input during our class discussion was on the federal rules. He had a Texan accent. I still remember distinctly. He always wore cowboy boots to class, and he would sit back. We were in a classroom which is directly across the hall from where I am today, and he would sit back, and he'd have these big cowboy boots, and he'd prop both feet up on the table in front of him, and he'd lean back in the chair. And this class would go on for an hour, and he would rarely, if ever, move from that position. Even if he called on students for questions, he still sat down. But I still remember these big feet sticking up in the air, blocking his face. And another interesting story, I remember Louis Schwartz was an impeccable dresser. He just, every day came in with a beautiful suit, beautiful tie, lovely, everything he wore was just perfect. But he was very fastidious about his shoes. So he used to have his shoes shined right before the lecture in the morning. We always had Louis Schwartz at 9 o'clock for criminal law. And I still remember there was an African-American gentleman who was in those days called a bootblack. Today you wouldn't use that term. He would have this gentleman come in and actually shine his shoes right outside of the classroom door before he would begin his lecture. And he would do that 3 days a week when we had criminal law. So some great stories. Culturally, obviously the law school was so much different then. We had, I think, 3 women. We had no people of color in our class. So we're talking about a class of 124, all white male except for 3 women, maybe 4 women, 4 I think. Again, a big age disparity between the senior people who had, I said, some were in their late 30s, others were like me, 21, very naive, just coming out of college, not knowing what law school was even going to be all about. And it was a kind of culture where you didn't really interact with your fellow students because it was strictly there. Everybody was strictly there, most of them strictly there to get their law degree, obviously attend class, and after class there were really no rooms to socialize or really just hang around. I was lucky enough, I lived in the student dorms at that time. We had student dorms. We had 2 halls, Pepper Hall and Roberts Hall. And they were lovely dorms where today is the site of the Biddle Law Library, but they were great dorms. And in the center was a big cafeteria. So having the advantage of living on campus, I would obviously want to socialize with my friends, but we had a lot of the students who right after class, because of their financial situation, a lot of them worked. They had part-time jobs. Others were married, so they got back to their families. They had dinner with their wives. So as far as intermingling and intermixing with the fellow law students, it was just very, very difficult, and not much of that went on. And we didn't have clubs like you have today. There's 99 or different activity groups, nothing like that. They had the law clubs, which were more emblematic of just being a name. They had very few social functions, and the old traditional law clubs, in those days, you joined a law club, but there was really nothing going on once you joined. I don't think there was ever. I joined the Kent Law Club, which a lot of my friends joined, and I don't think we may have had one social event in 3 years. So it was a totally different experience, but still it was a pleasure, and I enjoyed my 3 years here. And my career path after I got out, I had to go in the service. In those days, you took a commitment. It was draft time, so I had gotten a deferment right out of college to go to law school, but I owed the government my time in military, so when I graduated, I went right in basic training to Fort Knox, as a lot of my classmates did. And I did the 6 months program. I did 3 months at Fort Knox for basic, then I did 3 months at Fort Bliss for missile training, and then when I finished that, I came back and I had to do 6 years reserve duty, which was really no problem at all. In fact, it was sort of fun because it was 1 weekend a month. But I started my first job with a 4 or 5 man law firm. It was called Francis E. Marshall, and at that time it was a strictly a litigation firm. My career path was getting into civil litigation, and our business was just growing, and we did a lot of admiralty work and a lot of admiralty personal injury work. So I was fortunate enough in my first year to be able to try my first case before. I was actually in my first year with Frank Marshall, and I tried my first jury trial in Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, and then I tried my first jury trial in federal court, which was a maritime cause of action, a personal injury cause of action, and got a lot of trial experience. It was very fortunate, and learned a lot from Frank. Frank was also a Penn Law grad who came here on the GI Bill and graduated in 1948, and he was a great mentor, and I'm very indebted to Frank, and Frank unfortunately passed away, but what a brilliant trial lawyer, and I learned a lot from Frank, and to this day, when I try a case, I still have memories of sitting in that courtroom as second chair with Frank and seeing Frank make these spellbinding closing speeches, which he was just phenomenal. So I still practice law today. I went out on my own in 1980 and continued litigation, and then about 3 years ago, I met a few lawyers from New York who were starting a Philly office. They were a New York firm, and that firm is Wade Clark Mulcahy. And they wanted to open a Philly office, and our practices were very similar in that we both do insurance work, insurance defense work. So they asked me if I would come in and help them start the Philadelphia office and stay on of counsel, which I've done, and that's worked out. It's a great arrangement for both of us. We started with just 2 lawyers, Bob Cosgrove and myself, in 2010, and now we're up to 4 attorneys, plus we have 4 law clerks. So it's been a rapid growth in that business. I still do my own. I have still my own practice, and my arrangement with Wade Clark is that if I have something scheduled, one of my own matters, that takes precedent. But when I have time, I help them out with depositions. I do a lot of mentoring to the young lawyers too, and help them. They're just cutting their teeth on how to take a deposition and how to prepare an appellate brief and things like that. So I love to help them out too. So I'm enjoying practicing law. I'm not going to retire, at least not in the near future. I find it challenging every day, and every day is a new adventure, and hopefully if my health stays well, I'm going to continue. Thank you very much.